All right. So I've got 50 minutes to try to fit 10 weeks of content into this. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Tatolach, Inam Winik Dwas, Kyle Pittman, Eden Was, Nimipu. Good afternoon. My name is Kyle Pittman. I'm a descendant of the Nez Perce and Yakima peoples. My family comes originally from Lapwai, Idaho. So a long ways away, but I grew up over here on this side of the mountains in Tacoma, Washington, on the Puyallup Indian Reservation. Those are the people whose lands I've resided upon for my childhood, and I owe them a lot of gratitude and honor for that. Today, though, I live on the lands of the Squaliapsh, the Nisqually peoples, out in Roy, Washington. Not that city, the town of Roy, unincorporated Roy, much like this. In the shadow of Tacoma, the mountain, right? That's the Nisqually name for what many people now call Mount Rainier, translates into "don't forget the waters." And I think that's important to acknowledge where we come from and to acknowledge who we are. And to give you just a bit more about me, my parents, my mom is Turtle Simpson, my dad is William Pittman, my paternal grandparents are William Pittman and Greta Lou Spurgeon, and my maternal grandparents are Jimmy Hugh Simpson and Diana Joyce Simpson, or formerly Enos. And I tell you that because in traditional ways of greeting each other amongst indigenous peoples, usually it's this really long, lengthy introduction about who you are, who your family is, and where you come from, wherever that may be. And the purpose behind that is to ground the person who's introducing themselves in a connection to you, a person, or the group of people that they're introducing themselves to. And that act in of itself is something that is deeply rooted in the topic that we're going to discuss today, which is the idea of American Indian philosophies, plural. That's important, philosophies. When you introduce yourself, you're not just establishing a connection in a very literal sense, but you're going above and beyond that. You're naming who your relationships are. And this idea of your relationships is very central. It's very key to many indigenous philosophies of ways of knowing, being, and thinking. When you're identifying those relationships and those connections that you have with each other, you're placing yourself in a greater web of relationships. And that's how people get to know who you are. And really, as we'll talk about it a little bit later here in this lecture, the idea of relationships, or what in Indigenous studies we call relationality, that in itself is very central to many Indigenous philosophies, right? So we've already begun the lesson, right, talking about that. A little bit more about me. I am a member of the faculty at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. It's where I teach. Yeah, woo, thank you. I've been teaching there. It's actually the end of my second year of full-time teaching. Before that, I was an adjunct there. And before that, I was a carpenter. Yeah, I know, right? Quite a segue. Yeah, segues are weird. I did that for a little bit. I had an epiphany on a job site. This old-time carpenter came up to this pony wall that we were building. This was out in Federal Way, and he was leaning over it. He was grabbing his back, arching it. He looks at me. I was just coming back from lunch break. He's like, "Get out while you can, kid." And I took that lesson. So I went back to college, found myself at Northwest Indian College. I was like, college for Indians, never heard about that. Went there, and then I transferred to Evergreen to finish my undergrad, and then I went to grad school there at Evergreen. And that's basically how I ended up being a professor. I also developed a lot of abandonment issues in my undergrad. I didn't want to leave, and so I was like, okay, I'm just going to stay here. And then my boss made a job for me as professor, and that's kind of how it worked. So I say that to preface this by saying, I talk a lot about giving lectures, and I teach a lot of classes every year. If anybody's ever interested, I also used to work in admissions, and I still got contacts there. I can get you into Evergreen State College. Just talk to me afterwards. I like to plug a lot of my classes. I do a lot of lecturing, though, and a lot of people sometimes they come up and they ask like, "Oh, why do you do so much lecturing? That's such a Western way of conveying information. Having people sit there and listen to you is like you're the authority or gatekeeper of knowledge and delivering that to them. This kind of banking model of education. Maybe some of you have heard from Paulo Freire, pedagogy of the oppressed. And I always like to engage in dialogue with that and say, well, Talking is something that Indians do really, really well. And in fact, Mary Ellen Hilaire, who was the first Native American woman faculty at the Evergreen State College of the Lummi Nation back in the 70s, she described that there were 4 methods that should be used when trying to either teach in an indigenous way with an indigenous pedagogy or teaching indigenous students or those who want to study indigenous studies. She identified those as art, song, dance, and talk. And I like to liken lectures a lot to that last method there of talking, especially because I'm not that great of a dancer or singer, and my artistic abilities could use a little bit of work beyond my stick figures. So that's primarily why I choose to preface it by saying that, because that, again, also plays into this concept of philosophy that we're going to be diving into. So don't mind me, I just have a few notes here. I like to speak extemporaneously, but I had a few of these notes here because I like to bring this up specifically. When we're talking about philosophy, many of us are probably really familiar with several figures, right? Whether from our own education or we hear constantly in the media or we just hear in popular culture, these giants of philosophical thought that much of the ways that we think about the world derive from. We might think of Plato, right? Probably plenty of us have heard of Plato, primarily responsible for this idea we call theories of form, which were non-physical and absolute essences that existed beyond material representation. And that's just kind of a long-winded way of talking about, again, a very common facet of how we perceive the reality, that there are things that might exist here, right? This bottle of water, versus things that exist out there. What does this bottle of water represent? Or more grandiose ideas. That's basically what Plato's suggesting with this idea of theory of forms. We might be familiar with Pythagoras, right? I talked about being a carpenter. Pythagoras, Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And if you've done any carpentry, you use that one quite a bit. Contributed a lot to mathematics. Cicero, Roman statesman. We might think of him, he had a lot of writings about politics and what society should look like in terms of ethical standards, right? And also imperialism. Had a lot of thoughts about imperialism, not good thoughts. Confucius, right? Maybe shifting a little bit from this idea of Western foundation of thought to more Eastern foundation of thought, grounded himself in the study of ethics and politics, kind of similar to Cicero, but he really stressed the superiority of personal exemplification over explicit rules of behavior and reciprocity in the form of the silver rule. We might be familiar with the golden rule, do unto others what you'd want done unto yourself. The silver rule, kind of the opposite of that, don't do unto others what you don't want done to yourself. Again, stressing this notion of reciprocity and not imposing one's ideas or projecting them upon other people. We might think of Zoroaster. Or any Zoroastrians in the crowd? Maybe, I don't know. Typically categorized as like the first monotheistic religion, goes back quite a few years, thousands of years. Him specifically as a prophet of Persia and the one who's of course the religion's named after. His religious texts specifically, they emphasize the freedom of the individual to choose right or wrong and to take responsibility for their own deeds. Now that might sound, again, familiar. All of these thinkers, right, that just talked about here have contributed something to the world in general, but even here in the Western world where we derive our understanding about how the world works. And that's why we're talking about philosophy today. Philosophy is the attempt to ask questions, a process of investigation to understand how our world or worlds work and why that matters. There's many different branches of philosophy when we get into it. And today, of course, I'm talking a lot about the Western world, and don't worry, I'm going to move away from that. But I'm doing that because I'm kind of trying to ground us in what we may already be familiar with. Talking about American Indian philosophies is difficult because there are 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States alone. That is not counting state-recognized tribes, unrecognized tribes, or indigenous peoples that exist outside the borders of the United States. 574 is a lot. And many of those, they're not just single tribes. They are confederacies. They are collections of tribes. The Colvilles, Tulalip, Muckleshoot, Yakima, We recognize those as single polities, single individual political entities, but they are actually confederacies made up of multiple bands and tribes. And so when you think about it that way, right, it's difficult to talk about American Indian philosophies because there's a ton of them. So to try to synthesize that, right, and bring that all down is very difficult. So the goal with today is we're going to, again, mention some of these Western thoughts that we might be familiar with, and then we're going to juxtapose them with ideas that are indigenous-based, right? Some things that are kind of common amongst many tribes, but then also some things that have some particular perspectives or peculiarities unto themselves. Yeah, woo, yeah, hey, yeah. So, I'm going to focus on just 4 more Western voices, unfortunately, but again, they kind of play into the juxtaposition we're going to do. We might be familiar with John Locke, right? A bit more recent than some of these other ones that were mentioned. He's considered the father of liberalism and committed to the philosophical idea of empiricism, right? That we can empirically validate knowledge and things with our senses, that we can see it, that we can hear it, we can taste it, we can feel it. Those kinds of things with the idea of empiricism. Immanuel Kant, who talked about everything under the sun, I mean, I'll give him that, and really bridged the gap between rationalism and empiricism, and he introduced transcendental idealism, which if you try to boil that down, you get a book. So it's really, I'm not even going to really talk about that. But I mean, to sum it up, it's basically like objects in space and time are merely appearances, and we can't really know their substance. I mean, kind of, again, a form of idealism. Anyways. Thomas Hobbes, who was an endorser of the social contract and who greatly influenced our modern understanding of political states. Thomas Hobbes, I got a bent to pick with him because he very much pushes this idea that humans are innately greedy creatures and that it's because of that you have repression of the state and the need for law and order in order to quell the nature of human beings who are just rapacious and selfish. Right, and I'm sure we can see that. Yeah, boo, yeah. I'm sure we could see a lot of that in our world today, right, where people have that mentality. Oh, well, these other forms of economics aren't going to work because humans are just greedy people, right? Humans will subvert the altruism that these other systems might try to endorse, right? And that speaks a lot to values, what we as human beings base our motives and beliefs on. And then, of course, there was Rousseau, a French philosopher who, again, also endorsed the social contract and emphasized the state of nature as a normative guide for human behavior. He basically kind of critiqued Hobbes and said, well, yes, human natures are greedy beings, but when they were primitive, before civilization, before we got to this point of technocratic states, they were pure in form, pure in reason, and they have devolved now because of this, descended, right, kind of a declension narrative into this idea that human beings ended up this way. So again, kind of a critique, but still kind of following a similar thread as well. But we talk about all of those names, we hear those names frequently in many capacities, but do we hear about indigenous philosophers? In fact, does that even sound coherent in a sense, right? Maybe in our upbringing or in our education, the idea that indigenous peoples have philosophers, can we name any of them? That's not something that's really talked about. Yet, despite the fact that many indigenous ideas have actually influenced the creation of the United States, for example, the Constitution, based heavily on the Great Law of Peace put forward by the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, or other ideas around democracy, ideas around egalitarianism, ideas around pragmatism, which we'll talk about. Those things have come from indigenous ideas and from, despite the fact that it's happening during colonization, the resilience of indigenous peoples to be able to enter dialogue in certain spaces and exchange ideas, or with colonialism, have ideas taken. We see those threads having now actually exist and manifest in the Western world. But those origins have been erased. They've been obscured. And so we'll explore some of those, right? Make some connections, but then also have some novel thought about this as well. So just to kind of give us an idea, right? Let's go back to that. What about naming people, indigenous philosophers that we might not know of? Has anybody heard of Black Elk? Yeah, a couple hands. Black Elk Speaks, right? Real well-known book, interviews with Black Elk, who was a Lakota medicine man and who was interviewed by a poet and had a book published. There's a lot of criticism about the book nowadays, but that book was really one of the first ones to kind of break through this colonial gaze and try to present a bit of an indigenous thought that was very counter to many of the ideas put forward in the Western world. And so it was from Black Elk that we learn heavily about an indigenous bent towards syncretism, the idea that you can blend religious beliefs. Even though Black Elk was a Lakota medicine man, he himself converted to Catholicism, right, as a result of colonialism. But he never stopped practicing his traditional Lakota ways and actually came to the point of fusing those two, to the point where it was said that he would pray both with his pipe, traditional in the sweat lodge, for example, and with his rosary. So, we get this idea that this idea of syncretism then from his experience that's relayed through the interviews that he did. How about John Fire Lame Deer? Anyone heard of him? Oh, man, you got to check out his book. Yeah, it's a really good book, John Fire Lame Deer. He was another Lakota medicine man who described his journey on the Red Road of Recovery. Has anybody heard of the Red Road? Okay, yeah, I got some hands out there, right? He was one, again, a personal narrative that made it out there in written form that really talked about his journey and the struggles he had with the results of colonialism, with addiction, with alcoholism, with poverty, and how through his spiritual beliefs in traditional Lakota ways was able to overcome those, right? And again, really laid down this idea that many indigenous peoples now refer to as the Red Road. The Great Peacemaker, who was a founder and prophet of the Haudenosaunee, who contributed into making their oral constitution that I talked about, the Great Law of Peace, and that actually is the inspiration for many facets of the modern U.S. Constitution. Right? And this idea of democracy wasn't something that was brought to the Americas, reaching all the way back to the Greeks and Romans. It was already here. It already existed amongst several different polities, and the Haudenosaunee are most notable for that. How about Sarah Winnemucca? Anyone heard of Sarah Winnemucca? No? Okay, cool. I'm glad somebody brought it up. She was a Northern Paiute woman who wrote the first ethno-historical book about the first ethno-historical book that was by an American Indian woman, American Indian in general, and advocated for the rights of Native Americans under imposed colonial structures. So trying to work within these Western socio-political frameworks. There was Zikala Shah. So some people have heard of Zikala Shah, a Yankton Dakota woman who described the cultural identity conflicts between indigenous peoples and the dominant Euro-American culture. John Trudell. Anyone heard of John Trudell? Yeah, there we go. John Trudell fans. I know, a big fan of John Trudell. Rest in peace, passed away not too long ago. Santi Dakota, who explored the inner space of human beings and the relationship we have to the technologic reality that erodes our spirituality. He had this really great piece talking about how the technology of today objectifies human beings and turns them into machines to be mined. Our intelligence, our very thoughts and ability to think are being mined by the machines that continue to perpetuate the systems that exploit us. So it's no longer just your labor that is being exploited, but your very intelligence. And that's why he encouraged us that we should all use our intelligence as intelligently as possible. And then Vine Deloria Jr., my favorite, big giant in Indian country, Standing Rock Sioux historian, theologian, lawyer, and a philosopher. And he detailed mostly the socio-political conditions of American Indians, but he wrote an entire book on metaphysics, which is, man, a trippy read. So I highly recommend it. It was a very good book. But like I said, I bring up these voices now because these are ones that we might not be familiar with for various reasons, right? These are the voices that are erased, that are eroded, that are not spoken about, despite the fact that they've had influence on our way of life and the way of life that I think many of us here are trying to get back to, are trying to obtain, or trying to endorse over the technocratic, capitalistic lifestyles that are ruining the earth, that are harming our relationships to one another and to our four-leggeds, our two-leggeds, the winged animals, right? The non-human beings that also live on this planet. So, yeah, endorsement, yes. Thank you, Alex. So, when one of the takeaways from today, I would very much encourage some of these names, if you've written them down or you remember them, look them up and see what they've contributed, see what they've written, and the types of ideas that are put out there. And you might find it that you connect to many of the things they're saying. But to get back to our idea now of philosophy, philosophy has many different branches. I've mentioned metaphysical, but there's also the idea of ontological, which is the branch of philosophy that deals with the nature of existence. Questions about, like, God, for example, or of creation. There's epistemology, the idea or the concept or the study of how do we know what we know. It's the area of knowledge. There's axiology, which is the area of values and aesthetics. What do we as human beings value? How do we create values, for example, that we then found our behavior or actions on? Or how do we find value in things? There's a whole other branches of other things. There's cosmology. I'll talk about that a little bit. The idea that our existence and our beliefs and things exist, of course, amongst the universe, in kind of the creation of everything that is. Depending on who you talk to, some will say, like, ontology is under epistemology, which is under cosmology, or they say epistemology is on top. They create a hierarchy out of it. I don't think hierarchies really matter. These are just different ways of talking about similar ideas or different aspects of ideas, right? So we don't have to put a hierarchy to it. But just to give you some grounding in it, right, these are different areas of philosophical thought. Philosophy, the term, it comes from this idea called, this Latin term, philosophia, love of knowledge, pursuit of wisdom, systematic investigation. And, I think that works to ground us in a common idea or understanding about what it is we're talking about. But like we said, ultimately, when we talk about philosophy, we're talking about the engagement of inquiry, of studying things, of trying to understand our purpose here, or trying to understand the meaning behind certain things, right? We are all philosophical beings. We have all engaged in it. When you have gone out and made a decision, about what's good or what's wrong, about why you do certain things certain ways, whether it's OCD or an intentional decision, those are all based around ideas that you can pinpoint to philosophical grounding, philosophical roots. So I want you to know that, right? Because we have this weird, maybe this is the greener in me coming out. We have this idea that all of these things are detached from each other when we study history, when we study religion, when we do a hobby, right? We go to work. They're not detached. They're all related to each other, right? This is the idea that they're interconnected. This is relationality manifesting beyond just human connections, but the fact that you have a relationship to anything and everything, the very ground you're sitting upon, these wood chips that are here, the words coming out of my mouth, you have a relationship to them, and that's creating reality, right? And when we talk about American Indian philosophies, one of those commonalities that kind of exists between all of them is this idea that our relationships are quite literally what forms reality. Quite literally. Without that, there is no reality. You don't think beyond that, because why would you? You don't have a relationship to which that's expressed. So we are constantly engaged in relationships, building relationships, changing relationships, and that in itself is the foundation of reality, and that's what matters. You need to be mindful of your relationships. You need to be accountable to your actions. You need to understand that, because if not, you're not leading your life in a good way. And if you're not leading your life in a good way, we're inconsistent then with our behaviors, and we do things, we commit actions that are harmful. Harmful to the earth, harmful to each other, harmful to non-humans, harmful to ourselves, right? So relationships, that's key to it. And the idea of American Indian philosophies then is exploring that. What does that mean? And how do we better ourselves? How do we better those relationships? How do we lead our life in a good way? That's the central question to American Indian philosophies. Another question. Do American Indians then practice philosophy in the ways that we have been describing, right? In this kind of Western ethnocentric way, if we were to try to take that definition and apply it? I would say yes. Very much so. I mean, differently, yes, but also we meet these kind of arbitrary standards set by Euro-American centricism. We have validity both in their world, but also our world. Of course, as we were talking about, it's kind of the machinations of the Western world that have obscured these things as to why that's the case. But we'll explore this. I want to give you a quote. This is a quote from Vine Deloria Jr. He says, "Tribal peoples have traditionally been understood by Westerners as the last remnants of a hypothetical earlier stage of cultural evolution. And this so-called primitive stage of human development is a necessary preamble to any discussion of human beings and the meaning of their lives. Indeed, the stereotype of the primitive peoples anchors the whole edifice of Western social thought." Oh, yeah, right. That's good thought. He states that because what he is saying, in a settler colonial society, like what much of the West is, the settler colonizer, and there's a lot of things to unpack with those terms, so take it very generally. The settler colonizer exists in opposition to the fact that an indigenous population exists. When you think of other places in the world, do we think of them as indigenous? Do we think of the French as indigenous? Do we call them indigenous? No, right? Do we call? I know there's Han Chinese, and they engage in a lot of colonialism. But China, for example, do we just like automatically first thought like Chinese people, indigenous? They're Chinese, right? We're talking about other places in the world where those populations of those nation states exist unto themselves. They do not exist in opposition to a recognizable colonizing force. But what are the places where we do recognize indigenous peoples? The United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, right? These Western nations where there's clearly a recognizable indigenous population. And so what Vine is saying there in that quote then is this idea that the settler colonizer has to other the indigenous peoples because it is actually an existential threat to themselves and to their thought, to their philosophy. That in order for the settler colonizer to even exist, there must be an indigenous person or indigenous population to marginalize and to other. If there wasn't, the settler colonizer would not exist, and the entire framework would break down. The whole system of exploitation breaks down then. Right? And so it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy in that way that settler colonialism must deem, so long as that's the structure that's still being utilized, must deem some other group as to be marginalized, as to be indigenous, to be attacked, right? To be in opposition to them. And that's what Vine is saying there in that quote when it comes to philosophical thought as well, that really Western philosophy, at least what we know today, and especially ones that have been developed in the presence of colonialism, right? So, I mean, yes, it was before then, but let's just arbitrarily choose the 1700s onwards, the Enlightenment period, right? That those thoughts developed not in a vacuum, not unto themselves, but in a dynamic relationship that was happening between settler colonial states and indigenous peoples. And so the two are linked. And that means Western thought has in some ways accounted for indigenous peoples, even if it's in this marginalizing factor. That's why we can see threads of indigenous thought woven into settler colonial thought, settler colonial philosophy, right? It's had to graft itself basically onto those ideas, those notions. So, as I mentioned, right, in the United States, 574 federally recognized tribes, not counting all of the other indigenous peoples. That's a lot of thought to accommodate for. Probably one of the most succinct ways then to put this idea of the diversity of thought is that the center of the universe was in the backyard for each and every tribe, right? And there was this idea, this principle that, it has really developed into kind of a cultural custom amongst many tribes, this idea of non-interference. I'll talk more about principles in a second here because they're not the same as like principles in Western philosophy, but this idea of non-interference. This is something you'll see amongst even tribal peoples today, the idea that you're not to interfere with other people and the things that they do, the idea that they are on their own journey. And that you let them proceed on that journey, not that you shouldn't ever intervene in it, but just generally speaking, you don't interfere with other people or other thoughts. Okay, still good on time. This idea, is captured, I think, really well in the notion, this analogy I read in a psychology article one time that was like trying to capture this. My dad, he was a counselor at the Pe Ell Tribal Treatment Center. So he, worked with a lot of people who were in recovery. And had to understand, of course, not just socially, but in this academic sense, this idea of like how people operate, right? And there was this article that he had that I remembered reading as saying, imagine this scenario. You have two people living together. You have a native and a non-native person. They're living together. They're roommates. And one night, the native roommate wants to go to the store. But rather than just outright asking his roommate, hey, can you use your car to take me to the store? He sees that his roommate is watching a show, his favorite show, let's say, right? Doesn't want to interfere with that. So, he goes and he sits on the couch and he watches the show with him for a little bit. And he's like, eventually makes a comment, hey, I've been meaning to go to the store, Non-native just continues to watch, still like, oh, okay, yeah. And then a few minutes later, maybe he gets up and he goes and he puts on his shoes, sits back down. All right. A few minutes later, gets up, goes and puts on his coat, sits back down. Gets up and then walks out the door and goes to the store. That's non-interference, right? This idea that the native roommate was choosing not to interfere with what his roommate was doing. Not because it was some big, giant moral dilemma or he was offended, but just this, okay, he's doing his own thing. I'm going to go ahead and do my own thing, right? And that might seem very simplistic, but that kind of thought is something that underscores many indigenous behaviors today, except for now when we get to this point where those paths, those walks of life are being interfered with, right, by the collective actions of humans as a whole, right? Where now what we're doing is jeopardizing the natural world for everybody, not just indigenous peoples. But that's just kind of, again, to center an idea. There are other different kinds of principles as well that, again, exist kind of commonly across many different tribes. So, again, if you're a tribal person or, you've got native friends, right, it might not be the same if you talk to them about this stuff. It might not be the same with everybody. So keep that in mind. But just some general ideas of what we're talking about here in terms of these commonalities. So one thing is place-based. Learning, place-based teachings, place-based beliefs. That's the idea, right, that when you're indigenous to a particular place, your ideas and your conceptions of the world are rooted in that specific place. And this is a big fundamental difference between who we categorize as like indigenous peoples and non-indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples are attached to a place. And more so, our stories and our beliefs, our construction of the world are attached to those places. So, for example, right, I told you earlier that my family comes from a town called Lapwai in Idaho. It's the seat of the Nez Perce government. If you were to drive along Highway 12 going towards the reservation, what you're going to notice right after you get past the casino is you'll see along the hillsides different kinds of markers, landmarks. You see this patch of grass that kind of looks like a bear, like a bear's head. You see a native man in a headdress lying down in the hills. You see these boulders that are kind of up on the ridges that we have a story where we called those elephants. You have a fishnet. You see a fishnet, right? And we have stories that are attached to each and every one of those. Heck, even if you look up at the moon, some people might see a man in the moon, an Indian man in the moon. My people, we see a frog in the moon, and we have a story attached to that. These are then beliefs about the world that are attached to our ontological, our epistemological, and our cosmological understanding of where we are in the universe that are directly attached to those places, right? And I'm sure each and every one of you have a story of where you come from, right? Even people that I meet, they're like, oh, well, I come from everywhere. I grew up here, grew up there, I traveled here, traveled there. Those are all contributing to your story, right? And you have memories and beliefs and things that are attached to those, relationships that are attached to those, right? So that all kind of plays into this place-based nature about indigenous philosophies. There's also pragmatism. So I mentioned that earlier. Pragmatism is typically thought of as like the first true, genuine American philosophy, school of thought that developed here in the 1800s. But I contend, and so does Scott Pratt, who wrote the book Native Pragmatism, that pragmatism is actually originated as an indigenous thought. And when we look at the America specifically, something that's deeply connected to American Indian thought. And he makes this argument based on observations about how many tribal cultures are built and structured. And this is a big point that I'd want to hone in on too. You know, there's these stereotypes that exist about indigenous peoples and indigenous ways of being, such as the noble savage kind of trope. You know, this idea that indigenous peoples are primitive beings who were so pure of character and yet so ignorant in thought that they could not possibly have a negative effect on the environment like what we see in modern industrial society now. That essentially indigenous peoples had no impact on the land. Well, let me tell you right now, that's not true. And I feel like many of you know this, right? You know, or we have some examples. It's been mentioned a lot in the news, how governments are bringing back controlled burns in order to clear out underbrush, right? To deal with the massive amounts of raging forest fires we get every year. The prairies, for example, right? We have this idea of these great vast grasslands where the buffalo roamed. Those were curated and created by the actions of indigenous peoples who lived out on the plains. We see it in just numerous ways, even out here in the Pacific Northwest, right? When it came to shell middens, for example, shell middens. Usually archaeologists call them trash heaps, but they actually, you can go and study them, right? They were pits in the ground where discarded shells were thrown, you know, after maybe a meal, for example. But it's actually showed that those leach their nutrients back into the ground, and they actually support biodiversity wherever you find them. Right? And these are intentional practices that were done over hundreds, thousands of years through this keen observation of indigenous peoples. And so if we had to liken what we're talking about here to a Western thought, maybe just to ease our transition in talking about this, indigenous peoples truly are empiricists. Right? They believe in both the seen, right? The things that we can observe, we can deduce through observation, through our senses, but also the unseen. Right? It's not a contradictory to talk about that. The Western thought draws strict lines at certain things like, let's say, dreams or hallucinations, for example. But for many indigenous peoples, engaging with those things through different ceremonies, through different processes, those things were just as valid as the type of interaction we're having right now, right? A conscious interaction. And so because of that, the seen and the unseen were both empirical to many indigenous peoples. What was happening in the spiritual realm, what was happening in the inner space, as Gregory Cajete talks about in his book Native Science, that exploration of the inner space was central to indigenous inquiry in their philosophies, our philosophies. Whereas Western philosophical thought was focused very externally, on the outside. Right? Where did colonizers go? Other places. Where do humans focus a lot of exploration now? The deep seas, outer space, right? Guided by this idea that we are externalizing reality, that what we need to look for, that what we need for our lives exists somewhere out there. But indigenous peoples recognized that we ourselves are the out there. We're part of nature. We are all part of this. We're not separate from it. We're not part of this kind of Christian theological belief that we are to subdue nature, but we are part of nature. And therefore, our exploration is on the inside. It's the searching of this inner space then. And that's what binds all of us humans together, is that we all have an inner space that we can interact with. But Western philosophy has proposed that that inner space is superstition. That inner space is fanciful, that it's not real, it's not objective. Ugh. That's a bad word. I don't even use that word. I tell my students outright when I go into my classes, I'm like, I don't believe in objectivity, so let's just get that right. And it really frazzles a lot of the scientists at Evergreen when I tell them that. They're like, you wouldn't say that to your colleagues. I'm like, heck yeah, I would. Don't be afraid to stand up for your beliefs. Totally reject that idea of objectivity. But bringing it back to this idea of pragmaticism, the reason that we do that, right, that we're talking about these things and how we build these relationships and that inner space is because it's pragmatic, it serves an end. If you see yourself as part of the world, then killing the world is killing yourself. It's killing your family. It's killing the animals you depend on. It's killing the water you depend on, right? It's a very practical way of looking at it. But people characterize it as this noble savage trope, this idea that indigenous peoples are primitive tree huggers who just love the world and are so pure of heart. And, you know, I think there's room for nuanced discussion about perceptions of the natural world, but I would say it's rooted in this value of pragmaticism that, yes, we care about the earth. My people believe that the natural world have spirits, right? And so we care about them as relatives, as beings. And at the same time, knowing that if the salmon, for example, go away, right, we're not just losing a relative, but we're losing our food source that at one time made up between 60 and 80% of our diet. And then we start seeing these health disparities form. We start seeing people, dying at younger ages, right? Because they have this diet that no longer matches with how our bodies developed in these specific geographic locations, right? See how they're all connected? All of these thoughts, they're all connected. Relationality. All right, I got 10 minutes. So the principles, I want to talk about that. Principles. So there are 4 key principles that I wanted to bring out here that kind of all relate to this, all of these ideas we're talking about here. These ideas, right, the first one we already talked about, which is known as the principle of relatedness, or that we're all connected. This is this idea of relationality. But another idea, and this one, these two combined, you'll really like, right? If you're digging what I'm saying. This first principle, or second principle, is called limits of questioning. Limits of questioning. What does that mean? It means the questions we choose to ask are more important than any truths that we might hope to discover in asking such questions. In the Western world, we engage in philosophical thought by asking questions. You know, we ask questions about depth. We ask questions about breadth. We ask questions of clarification. We ask questions for precision, right? And in the Western world, knowledge for knowledge's sake is a lofty goal. That's good, right? We should just explore and find out everything because it assumes, that kind of line of reasoning assumes that we as human beings are deserving of that. We're entitled to know the secrets of the universe. We're entitled to know the medicinal uses of every plant and herb. We're entitled to know how frequencies work, how robots operate. We're entitled to ask these questions. And we see that the world has been built on that. But when you talk about the limits of questioning principle, you acknowledge that the very types of questions you're asking actually have an impact on the construction of the world, which relates to the third principle, the meaning shaping principle. So you might hear a lot of indigenous peoples and you ask them a question, they might tell you, we don't talk about that. Right? That's taboo. That's we don't. When I was growing up, I wasn't allowed to look at the curtains at night or eat in the dark. My mom would just have it out with me if I did that, right? And I would ask her why, and she just said, she told me, right, it's because, like at nighttime, that's when the spirits are more active. But when I was a kid, she didn't tell me. She just said, that's just the way it is. It's just the way things are, right? Because there was a limit to the purpose of the question I was asking. I didn't need to question that. I just needed to know that was the case. And in due time, I would know what the answer is. And so that changes my behavior, right? If we acknowledge that there are some questions that we shouldn't ask, imagine how that will change the way we interact with the environment. Imagine if the person who discovered oil didn't, because he didn't ask those questions, right? Imagine if the team who created the nuclear bomb didn't need to ask the question, how do we defeat our enemies? Changes how we view things, right? And that, again, goes to that third principle, the meaning shaping principle, that what we choose to do, what we choose to think even, shapes the world. And so that moves indigenous thought outside of this critical theory, materialist reality kind of perspective in saying that the seen, but also the unseen matters. That what we choose to manifest as individuals that eventually goes into a collective thought, that matters. And that we need to be mindful of our relationships. We need to be mindful of how we choose to manifest thought because that will ultimately affect the way that reality is shaped. And that goes to the fourth principle, the last one, which is the moral universe principle. The idea that the universe is moral. Morality exists. It doesn't exist in this objective vacuum void where your actions, are just unto themselves, but rather that because the universe is moral, then things like truth-seeking and fact-finding are moral investigations, right? And you see how all of these four principles are connected, because if it's a moral investigation you're making, then that means there's a right and a wrong to the questions you're choosing to ask because of the results that they can have on the world because of your connection to the world. All four are related. So you can take those four principles away, right, as something that, again, maybe not every tribe, every group of indigenous peoples, but things that are very common amongst many forms of indigenous thought, that those things, along with the extra one, the non-interference principle, kind of all relate to each other. So with my final minutes here, I want to talk about one final thing, and that is, this idea of a paradigm. Paradigm, right? Got to challenge the dominant paradigm. All of these thoughts that we have, that we talk about, the way that we practically use them are in these things we call paradigms. If you've done any research, right, usually you have a paradigm for research. But these are basically the plan, right, the model, the articulation of these various ideas and beliefs into a coherent idea, a plan of action of how you're going to do something. If you ever engage in research, you usually have some sort of dominant paradigm that's guiding your thoughts and what you're doing. In the Western world, all of what we talked about here, their values and their philosophical beliefs get used primarily, there's other forms of thought, but primarily get used in philosophy in what we call positivist thought. Positivist thought assumes, really demands, that there is one single reality, that we all experience this together, and that's the basis of an objective reality. But indigenous thought says, well, hold on. If the center of the universe is in my backyard and my neighbor's backyard and the neighbor's backyard, right, that means there should be multiple realities, multiple worlds, right? And how do I dictate what these other worlds do or don't do, right? That's violating the non-interference principle. But then some people will argue, well, then does that mean you're saying reality is relativistic? Right? That, we can't judge anybody or make any conclusions because they're all just unto ourselves or as individuals or particular groups, right? And it's kind of used as a counterpoint if you're arguing with someone, let's say. And this, again, goes back to the idea of whether or not there's an objective reality. Well, that's a binary mode of thinking. I don't encourage a binary, right, whether it's either or, but rather acknowledging this multiplicity of thought. But Gregory Cajete, I talked about earlier, answers this for us, right? He kind of brings it back into this thought, talking about subjective objectivity, that because we are all connected, we all can have commonality in the experiences that we have, we can create an objective reality, but that is subjectively guided by those interpersonal interactions that we have with each other. So they're not an either or, but they're related. All of its ideas are related. And then that goes to this final notion I want to bring up here, then knowledge. Knowledge about how do we know what we know. If that's the case, if nothing's objective and, everything's externalized and abstract thought, right, or it's not, or it's all on the inside, how do we know anything then, right? Sometimes we get a little bit of an existential crisis going on. It's okay, breathe, don't worry. Things are real. They exist, okay, right? Thank you. Knowledge is defined by many indigenous peoples then as experience. You can experience knowledge. Knowledge isn't just this thing that exists in your head, but it's the things you do, the skills you learn, those relationships you practice, that you maintain, you actively engage in. Knowledge, how you accrue it or have it or practice it then, right, is an active process of engagement, of doing things, of experience, right? That goes to also back to this idea of empiricism and pragmaticism, that you have knowledge when you can practice that knowledge and you know why you're practicing that knowledge and you're choosing to do that, right, for practical means. If you're not doing that, right, limits of questioning. It's not really a question or knowledge worth having or asking, right? And so finally I'll say, 2 minutes. Finally I'll say, all of this, right, gets wrapped into indigenous worldviews. Indigenous worldviews, these are things that have existed and continue to exist. Colonialism did not erase them. Colonialism did damage, but they continued to persist, right? And as my goal coming here today to talk with y'all about that and kind of introduce you to some of these thoughts that just show that they're still real and they exist. And to think about it this way, right? That if you yourselves want to adopt some of these principles or engage with this knowledge, remember that it is a way of life. That it is a way of thinking, knowing, and being. And so it's not something to adopt, to appropriate and engage in for a little bit and then go back to our other lifestyles or ways, right? But that by engaging with this knowledge and forming relationships with indigenous communities, right, in an appropriate way, that we all can work towards ensuring that we can get back to these indigenous principles. Because I would argue this. Indigenous principles might seem like something that's different, might seem like something that's other, right, from this mainstream idea, our ideas that we practice. But if you think about it, John Trudell, he told us that if you go back far enough, everyone's indigenous to somewhere. And to me, that states then that the indigenous ways of doing things are the original ways of doing things that we all practiced. Thank you. Right on time.